The blacksmith's mistake. It was exactly 5 minutes past 4 as Mr. Robert Audley stepped out upon the platform at Shoreditch and waited placidly until such time as his dogs and his portmanteau should be delivered up to the attendant porter who had called his cab and undertaken the general conduct of his affairs with that disinterested courtesy which does such infinite credit to a class of servitors who are forbidden to accept the tribute of a grateful public. Robert Audley waited with consummate patience for a considerable time, but as the express was generally a long train, and there were a great many passengers from Norfolk carrying guns and pointers, and other paraphernalia of a critical description, it took a long while to make matters agreeable to all claimants, and even the barrister's seraphic indifference to mundane affairs nearly gave way. Perhaps, when that gentleman who is making such a noise about a pointer with liver-colored spots has discovered the particular pointer and spots that he wants, which happy combination of events scarcely seems likely to arrive, they'll give me my luggage and let me go. The designing wretches knew at a glance that I was born to be imposed upon, and if they were to trample the life out of me upon this very platform, I should never have the spirit to bring an action against the company. Suddenly an idea seemed to strike him, and he left the porter to struggle for the custody of his goods, and walked round to the other side of the station. He had heard a bell ring, and, looking at the clock, had remembered that the down train for Colchester started at this time. He had learned what it was to have an honest purpose since the disappearance of George Talboys, and he reached the opposite platform in time to see the passengers take their seats. There was one lady who had evidently only just arrived at the station, for she hurried onto the platform at the very moment that Robert approached the train, and almost ran against that gentleman in her haste and excitement. "I beg your pardon," she began ceremoniously, then raising her eyes from Mr. Audley's waistcoat, which was about on a level with her pretty face, she exclaimed, "Robert, you in London already?" "Yes, Lady Audley, you were quite right. The Castle Inn is a dismal place, and you got tired of it. I knew you would. Please open the carriage door for me. The train will start in 2 minutes." Robert Audley was looking at his uncle's wife with rather a puzzled expression of countenance. "What does it mean?" he thought. "She is altogether a different being to the wretched, helpless creature who dropped her mask for a moment and looked at me with her own pitiful face in the little room at Mount Standing 4 hours ago. What has happened to cause the change?" He opened the door for her while he thought this, and helped her to settle herself in her seat, spreading her furs over her knees and arranging the huge velvet mantle in which her slender little figure was almost hidden. "Thank you very much. How good you are to me," she said as he did this. "You will think me very foolish to travel upon such a day without my dear darling's knowledge too, but I went up to town to settle a very terrific milliner's bill, which I did not wish my best of husbands to see, for indulgent as he is, he might think me extravagant, and I cannot bear to suffer even in his thoughts." "Heaven forbid that you ever should, Lady Audley," Robert said gravely. She looked at him for a moment with a smile, which had something defiant in its brightness. "Heaven forbid it, indeed," she murmured. "I don't think I ever shall." The second bell rang, and the train moved as she spoke. The last Robert Audley saw of her was that bright, defiant smile. "Whatever object brought her to London has been successfully accomplished," he thought. "Has she baffled me by some piece of womanly jugglery? Am I never to get any nearer to the truth? But am I to be tormented all my life by vague doubts and wretched suspicions, which may grow upon me till I become a monomaniac? Why did she come to London?" He was still mentally asking himself this question as he ascended the stairs in Fig Tree Court, with one of his dogs under each arm and his railway rugs over his shoulder. He found his chambers in their accustomed order. The geraniums had been carefully tended, and the canaries had retired for the night under the cover of a square of green baize, testifying to the care of honest Mrs. Maloney. Robert cast a hurried glance round the sitting room. Then setting down the dogs upon the hearthrug, he walked straight into the little inner chamber which served as his dressing room. It was in this room that he kept disused portmanteaus, battered japanned cases, and other lumber, and it was in this room that George Talboys had left his luggage. Robert lifted a portmanteau from the top of a large trunk, and kneeling down before it with a lighted candle in his hand, carefully examined the lock. To all appearance, it was exactly in the same condition in which George had left it when he laid his mourning garments aside and placed them in the shabby repository, with all other memorials of his dead wife. Robert brushed his coat sleeve across the worn, leather-covered lid, upon which the initials G.T. were inscribed with big brass-headed nails. But Mrs. Maloney, the laundress, must have been the most precise of housewives, for neither the portmanteau nor the trunk were dusty. Mr. Audley dispatched a boy to fetch his Irish attendant, and paced up and down his sitting room, waiting anxiously for her arrival. She came in about 10 minutes, and, after expressing her delight in the return of the master, humbly awaited his orders. "I only sent for you to ask if anybody has been here, that is to say, if anybody has applied to you for the key of my rooms today. Any lady?" "Lady? No, indeed, your honour. There's been no lady for the kay. Barrin' it's the blacksmith, your honour manes." "The blacksmith?" "Yes, the blacksmith your honour ordered to come today." "I order a blacksmith?" exclaimed Robert. "I left a bottle of French brandy in the cupboard," he thought, "and Mrs. M. has been evidently enjoying herself." "Sure, and the blacksmith your honour told to see to the locks," replied Mrs. Maloney. "It's him that lives down in one of the little streets by the bridge," she added, giving a very lucid description of the man's whereabouts. Robert lifted his eyebrows in mute despair. "If you'll sit down and compose yourself, Mrs. M," he said. He abbreviated her name thus on principle, for the avoidance of unnecessary labor. "Perhaps we shall be able by and by to understand each other. You say a blacksmith has been here?" "Sure, and I did, sir." "Today?" "Quite correct, sir." Step by step, Mr. Audley elicited the following information. A locksmith had called upon Mrs. Maloney that afternoon at 3 o'clock and had asked for the key of Mr. Audley's chambers, in order that he might look to the locks of the doors, which he stated were all out of repair. He declared that he was acting upon Mr. Audley's own orders, conveyed to him by a letter from the country, where the gentleman was spending his Christmas. Mrs. Maloney, believing in the truth of this statement, had admitted the man to the chambers, where he stayed about half an hour. "But you were with him when he examined the locks, I suppose?" Mr. Audley asked. "Sure, and I was, sir, in and out, as you may say, all the time, for I've been cleaning the stairs this afternoon, and I took the opportunity to begin my scouring while the man was at work." "Oh, you were in and out all the time. If you could conveniently give me a plain answer, Mrs. M., I should be glad to know what was the longest time that you were out while the locksmith was in my chambers." But Mrs. Maloney could not give a plain answer. It might have been 10 minutes, though she didn't think it was as much. It might have been a quarter of an hour, but she was sure it wasn't more. It didn't seem to her more than 5 minutes. "But them stairs, your honour." And here she rambled off into a disquisition upon the scouring of stairs in general, and the stairs outside Robert's chambers in particular. Mr. Audley sighed the weary sigh of mournful resignation. "Never mind, Mrs. M," he said. "The locksmith had plenty of time to do anything he wanted to do, I dare say, without your being any the wiser." Mrs. Maloney stared at her employer with mingled surprise and alarm. "Sure, there wasn't anything for him to stale, your honour, barrin' the birds and the geraniums and—" No, I understand. There, that'll do, Mrs. M. Tell me where the man lives, and I'll go and see him." "But you'll have a bit of dinner first, sir." "I'll go and see the locksmith before I have my dinner." He took up his hat as he announced his determination, and walked toward the door. "The man's address, Mrs. M.?" The Irishwoman directed him to a small street at the back of Sir Bride's church, and thither Mr. Robert Audley quietly strolled, through the miry slush which simple Londoners call snow. He found the locksmith, and, at the sacrifice of the crown of his hat, contrived to enter the low narrow doorway of a little open shop. A jet of gas was flaring in the unglazed window, and there was a very merry party in the little room behind the shop. But no one responded to Robert's "Hulloa." The reason of this was sufficiently obvious. This merry party was so much absorbed in its own merriment as to be deaf to all commonplace summonses from the outer world, and it was only when Robert, advancing further into the cavernous little shop, made so bold as to open the half-glass door which separated him from the merrymakers, that he succeeded in obtaining their attention. A very jovial picture of the Teniers School was presented to Mr. Robert Audley upon the opening of this door. The locksmith, his wife and family, and 2 or 3 droppers in of the female sex were clustered about a table, which was adorned by 2 bottles, not vulgar bottles of that colorless extract of the juniper berry, much affected by the masses, but of bona fide port and sherry, fiercely strong sherry, which left a fiery taste in the mouth, nut brown sherry, rather unnaturally brown, if anything, and fine old port, no sickly vintage, faded and thin from excessive age, but a rich, full-bodied wine, sweet and substantial, and high-colored. The locksmith was speaking as Robert Audley opened the door. "And with that," he said, "she walked off, as graceful as you please." The whole party was thrown into confusion by the appearance of Mr. Audley, but it was to be observed that the locksmith was more embarrassed than his companions. He set down his glass so hurriedly that he spilt his wine, and wiped his mouth nervously with the back of his dirty hand. "You called at my chambers today," Robert said quietly. "Don't let me disturb you, ladies." This to the droppers in. "You called on my chambers today, Mr. White, and—" The man interrupted him. "I hope, sir, you'll be so good as to look over the mistake," he stammered. "I'm sure, sir, I'm very sorry it should have occurred. I was sent for to another gentleman's chambers, Mr. Alwyn, in Garden Court, and the name slipped my memory, and having done odd jobs before for you, I thought it must be you as wanted me today, and I called at Mr. Maloney's for the key of Cordon, but directly I see the locks in your chamber, I says to myself, the gentleman's locks ain't out of order, the gentleman don't want all his locks repaired. But you stayed half an hour." "Yes, sir, for there was one lock out of order, the door nighest the staircase, and I took it off and cleaned it and put it on again. I won't charge you nothing for the job, and I hope you'll be so good as to look over the mistake that as has occurred, which I've been in business 13 years come July, and—" "Nothing of this kind ever happened before, I suppose," said Robert gravely. "No, it's altogether a singular kind of business, not likely to come about every day. You've been enjoying yourself this evening, I see, Mr. White. You've done a good stroke of work today, I'll wager. Made a lucky hit, and you're what you call standing treat, eh?" Robert Audley looked straight into the man's dingy face as he spoke. The locksmith was not a bad-looking fellow, and there was nothing that he need have been ashamed of in his face, except the dirt, and that, as Hamlet's mother says, is common. But in spite of this, Mr. White's eyelids dropped under the young barrister's calm scrutiny, and he stammered out some apologetic sort of speech about his missus, and his missus's neighbors, and port wine and sherry wine, with as much confusion as if he, an honest mechanic in a free country, were called upon to excuse himself to Mr. Robert Audley for being caught in the act of enjoying himself in his own parlor. Robert cut him short with a careless nod. "Pray don't apologize," he said. "I like to see people enjoy themselves. Good night, Mr. White. Good night, ladies." He lifted his hat to the missus and the missus's neighbors, who were much fascinated by his easy manner and his handsome face, and left the shop. "And so," he muttered to himself as he went back to his chambers, "with that she walked off as graceful as you please. Who was it that walked off? And what was the story which the locksmith was telling when I interrupted him at that sentence? Oh, George Talboys, am I ever to come any nearer to the secret of your fate? Am I coming nearer to it now, slowly but surely? Is the radius to grow narrower day by day, until it draws a dark circle round the home of those I love? How is it all to end?" He sighed wearily as he walked slowly back across the flagged quadrangles in the temple to his own solitary chambers. Mrs. Maloney had prepared for him that bachelor's dinner which, however excellent and nutritious in itself, has no claim to the special charm of novelty. She had cooked for him a mutton chop, which was soddening itself between 2 plates upon the little table near the fire. Robert Audley sighed as he sat down to the familiar meal, remembering his uncle's cook with a fond, regretful sorrow. Her cutlets à la maintenant made mutton seem more than mutton, a sublimated meat that could scarcely have grown upon any mundane sheep, he murmured sentimentally, and Mrs. Maloney's chops are apt to be tough, but such is life. What does it matter? He pushed away his plate impatiently after eating a few mouthfuls. I have never eaten a good dinner at this table since I lost George Talboys, he said. The place seems as gloomy as if the poor fellow had died in the next room and had never been taken away to be buried. How long ago that September afternoon appears as I look back at it. That September afternoon upon which I parted with him alive and well, and lost him as suddenly and unaccountably as if a trapdoor had opened in the solid earth and let him through to the antipodes.